Bitter frost bit through Rachel Higgins's double-layered neoprene face mask, crystallizing the moisture of her breath into tiny, sharp needles of ice before it even hit the air. It was mid-January in the Oymyakon Valley, a remote depression in the Siberian tundra known as the Pole of Cold. The digital thermometer clipped to Rachel's parka read a staggering, incomprehensible 71 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, exposed human skin freezes solid in less than 2 minutes. Steel becomes brittle enough to snap under pressure, and the very air feels thick, heavy, and hostile. Rachel, a wildlife biologist leading an international permafrost ecology team, was 300 yards from the safety of Outpost Delta. She was struggling to repair a jammed meteorological sensor. The wind was howling, a relentless, deafening roar that drowned out the sound of her own heartbeat. Then, she tripped. Her heavy snow boots caught on an irregular mound beneath the powder. Groaning, Rachel brushed the snow aside, expecting to find a jagged piece of ice or a displaced rock. Instead, her thick, insulated gloves met something soft. Fur. She dropped to her knees. Buried beneath the drift was a silver fox. It was a juvenile, its beautiful dark gray and silver coat matted with ice. The animal was entirely motionless, curled into a tight, desperate ball. Its eyes were frozen shut, crusts of ice sealing its lashes. Rachel pulled off her outer mitt, risking the lethal cold for just a few seconds, and pressed 2 fingers against the animal's ribcage. A heartbeat. It was impossibly faint, agonizingly slow, perhaps 1 beat every 10 seconds, but it was there. Survival protocols at Outpost Delta were strict. Dr. Simon Abernathy, the expedition's rigid lead glaciologist, had drilled the rules into the team. No unnecessary risks, no deviations from the schedule, and absolutely no interference with the local wildlife. Bringing a wild, potentially diseased predator into the sterile, isolated environment of the research station was a fireable offense. Rachel looked at the desolate expanse of white. Leaving the fox here wasn't letting nature take its course. It was a guaranteed, agonizing death within the hour. Shoving the freezing animal into the oversized interior pocket of her parka against her chest to share her core heat, Rachel abandoned the sensor. She fought her way back to the outpost, the extra weight making every step against the gale a brutal struggle. When she cycled through the primary airlock and stumbled into the thawing room, Simon was waiting, his face flushed with anger as Rachel unzipped her coat and gently placed the stiff, icy bundle onto the stainless steel examination table. "Are you out of your mind, Rachel?" Simon shouted over the hum of the station's diesel generators. "You risked a frostbite amputation for a carcass? Get that thing out of here before you compromise our entire quarantine protocol." "He's not a carcass, Simon," Rachel fired back, her voice shaking as much from adrenaline as from the cold. She grabbed a stack of thermal blankets from the emergency medical kit. "He's in deep torpor. I am not throwing him back out into negative 71 degrees. For the next 48 hours, Rachel barely slept. She set up a makeshift incubator in the equipment bay, using heating pads and warm saline IV drips. The fox's body temperature was dangerously low, and his right ear was severely frostbitten. Rachel named him Phantom, due to the ghost-like silver sheen of his coat and the near-invisible pulse he had when she found him. Slowly, miraculously, Phantom thawed. His eyes, a striking, piercing amber, opened on the 3rd day. He was terrified, snapping weakly at Rachel's gloved hands when she tried to feed him a slurry of warmed meat paste. But Rachel was patient. She sat with him for hours, reading her research notes aloud in a soft, steady voice until the animal realized she was not a threat. Over the next 2 months, a profound bond formed. Phantom lost the tip of his right ear to frostbite, leaving him with a distinct, asymmetrical silhouette, but he regained his strength. He would follow Rachel around the equipment bay, watching her calibrate instruments, occasionally nudging her knee with his cold nose to demand a scrap of dried jerky. By late April, the brutal grip of the Siberian winter began to loosen. The sun rose higher, and the temperatures climbed to a manageable 15 degrees Celsius. Rachel knew what she had to do. Phantom was a wild predator, and keeping him confined in the sterile, metallic walls of Outpost Delta was a disservice to his nature. The morning of the release was silent. Simon stood by the airlock, his arms crossed, watching with a softened expression. He had never admitted it, but he had grown fond of the creature, too. Rachel walked a mile out onto the tundra. She set the transport crate down, unlatched the metal door, and stepped back. Phantom cautiously crept out. He sniffed the crisp air, his amber eyes scanning the vast, blindingly white horizon. He looked back at Rachel, tilting his head, his missing ear tip giving him a quizzical expression. "Go on," Rachel whispered, her throat tight. "You belong out there." Phantom lingered for a moment, then turned and bounded into the snow. Within seconds, his silver coat blended completely with the shadows of the ice drifts. He was gone. Rachel returned to the outpost with an ache in her chest, telling herself she had done the right thing. She threw herself back into her permafrost sampling, trying to fill the quiet void the fox had left behind. 8 months later, December returned with a vengeance. The station was hit by a freak katabatic storm downslope winds that accelerated to hurricane speeds, bringing temperatures crashing back down to 65 degrees Celsius. It was 2 a.m. when the primary diesel generator failed. The sound of the engine dying was more terrifying than an explosion. The sudden silence in the outpost meant one thing: death. Within minutes, the ambient temperature inside the insulated walls began to drop. Rachel and Simon rushed to the mechanical room. With flashlights clenched in their teeth, they desperately tried to clear the ice that had completely choked the generator's intake valve. But the metal was frozen solid. In his panic, Simon wrenched a heavy wrench against the intake manifold. The brittle metal shattered. A jagged piece of shrapnel tore through Simon's heavy protective suit and sliced deep into his thigh. Blood pooled rapidly, instantly freezing into a terrifying crimson slush on the floor. I can't feel my leg," Simon gasped, collapsing against the frosted wall. Rachel dragged him back to the main living quarters, applying a tight tourniquet. The station's secondary electrical heaters were running on battery backups, but they would only last 3 hours. They needed the emergency combustion heater located in Supply Cache Bravo, a reinforced bunker located half a mile away across the ice. "You can't go," Simon said, his teeth chattering violently, his face pale from blood loss. "It's a whiteout. You'll lose your bearings in 10 seconds. You'll freeze. If I stay, we both freeze," Rachel replied. She layered up: thermals, fleece, down, and a heavy Gore-Tex shell. She attached a safety tether to the airlock door, grabbed a heavy-duty sled, and stepped out into the void. The cold was an immediate physical assault. It felt as though her lungs were being crushed by an invisible weight. The wind battered her, knocking her to her knees instantly. Visibility was zero. She couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. Rachel crawled. She dragged herself along the ice, feeling the tension in the safety tether. She had to count her paces. 100, 200, at pace 300. Disaster struck. The safety tether, brittle from the extreme cold, snagged on a jagged ice outcrop. As Rachel lunged forward, the line snapped. She fell face first into the snow. Frantically, she grabbed for the tether, but the wind had already whipped the broken end away into the darkness. She was untethered, half a mile from the station, completely blind in a 71 degrees Celsius blizzard. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized her. She tried to retrace her steps, but within moments, she had completely lost her sense of direction. Was the cache ahead? Was the outpost behind her? The relentless wind pushed her from all sides, spinning her around. The cold began to seep into her bones. Her fingers and toes went numb, followed by a heavy, dangerous lethargy. The shivering stopped the final, terrifying stage of hypothermia before the body shuts down. This is it, Rachel thought, curling into a ball in the snow, ironically mimicking the exact posture she had found Phantom in a year earlier. Her eyes felt unbearably heavy. Sleep seemed so inviting, so warm. A sharp tug on her sleeve jolted her awake. Rachel blinked, her eyelashes heavy with ice. Through the swirling whiteout, a shape materialized. It was a silhouette, close to her face. A sharp nose, amber eyes, and an asymmetrical silhouette caused by a missing ear tip. Phantom. Rachel let out a choked sob. The fox nudged her face with his nose, whimpering loudly over the wind. He tugged at her heavy sleeve again, pulling her forward. But Phantom didn't just come to wake her up. From his jaws, he dropped something onto the snow directly in front of Rachel's face. It landed with a dull, heavy clink. Rachel, her hands practically useless, awkwardly brushed the snow away with her forearms. It was an object. Not a bone, not a piece of prey. It was a block of tarnished, heavy metal. She squinted. It was a Zippo lighter. But not just any lighter. Her heart stopped. Even through the ice and tarnish, she could see the distinct, custom-engraved crest of a hawk on the casing, and beneath it, the initials A.H. Andrew Higgins. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat, the freezing air burning her lungs. It was her father's lighter. Andrew Higgins had been a pioneer in Arctic geology. 19 years ago, his twin-engine survey plane vanished without a trace somewhere over this very sector of the Siberian tundra. Massive search and rescue operations had yielded nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no closure. It was the entire reason Rachel had become a wildlife biologist, the reason she had requested assignment to this brutal, desolate end of the earth. She had spent her life unconsciously searching for a ghost, and now, a wild fox had just dropped her father's lighter into the snow. Phantom barked a sharp, piercing sound and grabbed the sleeve of her parka again, pulling her to the left. Adrenaline, pure and explosive, flooded Rachel's system, pushing back the hypothermia. She grabbed the lighter, shoving it into her pocket, and forced herself onto her hands and knees. "Lead the way," she rasped. Phantom didn't lead her toward the supply cache, nor back toward the outpost. He led her perpendicular to the wind, navigating the blinding whiteout with instinctual precision. Rachel crawled behind him for what felt like hours, her body screaming in agony, entirely reliant on the faint gray shadow of the fox ahead of her. Suddenly, the wind stopped. Rachel collapsed onto hard rock. She blinked, trying to clear her vision. Phantom had led her into a deep, naturally formed ice cave, perfectly sheltered from the katabatic winds. But the cave wasn't empty. Looming in the shadows of the cavern was the twisted, snow-covered fuselage of a twin-engine aircraft. The tail numbers, though faded, were perfectly readable. It was her father's plane. Rachel dragged herself toward the wreckage. The cavern was incredibly cold, but without the wind chill, it was survivable. Phantom trotted ahead, slipping through a gap in the crushed cargo door. Rachel followed. Inside the preserved cabin, Rachel found what the search teams never could. The remains of her father and his co-pilot were there, peaceful, having succumbed to the cold nearly 2 decades ago, but resting on the navigator's table, perfectly preserved in the sub-zero, low-humidity environment, was a heavy, leather-bound journal. Rachel opened it with trembling hands. The final entry, dated 19 years ago, detailed their crash after a sudden engine freeze. But more importantly, it contained her father's final letters to her and her mother. "If you ever find this, Rachel," the final page read in his familiar sharp handwriting, "know that I was looking at your photograph when the cold finally took me. The ice is beautiful, but it holds nothing compared to the warmth of my family. Be brave. Brave." Tears, hot and immediate, streamed down Rachel's face, freezing on her cheeks. Beside the journal was a military-grade, hand-crank emergency radio beacon. Older models didn't rely on lithium batteries that died in the cold. They relied on kinetic energy. Rachel grabbed the crank and began to turn. She cranked until her shoulders burned, until the small green light on the console flickered to life. She broadcasted the emergency frequency, attaching her station's ID code. 4 hours later, the storm broke. The sudden silence was deafening. Rachel sat in the fuselage, her father's journal clutched to her chest. Phantom was curled at her feet, asleep, his thick tail draped over his nose. The faint, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter rotor echoed through the ice cave. The emergency signal had been picked up by a Russian military outpost 300 miles away. Rachel nudged Phantom awake. The fox stood, stretched, and looked at her with those amber eyes. He knew his job was done. As the sound of the approaching helicopter grew louder, Phantom slipped out of the fuselage, darting back into the shadows of the ice cave and disappearing into the tundra. When the rescue team burst into the cavern, they found Rachel alive, clutching the journal. They immediately deployed a secondary team to Outpost Delta, arriving just in time to save Simon from bleeding out and freezing in the dark. 6 months later, Rachel stood in a warm, sunlit office in Vancouver. The frostbite scars on her cheeks were a permanent reminder of the 71 degrees Celsius storm. Her father's remains had been brought home and laid to rest properly. The journal had provided the missing geological data her father had died collecting, revolutionizing their understanding of permafrost degradation. But Rachel's thoughts often drifted back to the pole of cold. She looked down at her desk, where the tarnished Zippo lighter sat, mounted on a small wooden stand. Science could explain how a fox survived the cold. Science could explain how a fox, being a natural scavenger, might find a shiny object near a cave it used for shelter. But science could never explain the precise timing, the impossible navigation through a blinding whiteout, or the profound debt a wild animal chose to repay in the dead of the polar winter. Rachel smiled, reaching out to trace the engraved A.H. with her thumb. She had saved a life in the brutal ice, and in return, she had been given back her own, along with the ghost of a father she thought she had lost forever.